So in our previous lecture, we talked about these earliest indigenous patterns, earliest indigenous presence in the Southwest. We're going to sort of move up that timeline now and talk about native cultures as they've largely been mapped by anthropologists and archaeologists and others in a more contemporary time period. So now we're going to move on to this time period of, the last couple of thousand years or so. But it's still a period of time before contact with Europeans, before the arrival of Spanish and other European groups in the Southwest, which isn't going to come until about the 1500s and 1600s. So again, remember that timeline that I showed you in the previous presentation of the different eras that we're talking about here. Now we're kind of moving up in time, but still looking at a period before the arrival of the Spanish. By the end of the lecture, you should be able to map indigenous cultural regions of the Southwest, and there's really four main ones here that we're looking to map. And these would be the Hohokam, Mogollon, Ancestral Pueblo, sometimes called Anasazi, and the Sinagua. There are some key sites within each of these culture regions that are important for you to know. And it's also important to understand how distinctive culture groups make distinctive cultural landscapes. I mean, how can we even describe different culture regions? Well, one of the reasons that we do that is we look at different ways that people live, the way they build their towns, their communities, the kind of material artifacts that they leave behind. And last but not least, it's also important for us to recognize the critical importance that this larger north-south axis of trade, transportation, and communication is playing in the development of the Southwest at this time. And we'll talk about why that axis of movement is so critical as we move through this lecture. So here are those cultural regions broadly defined here. There's three of them. There's three of the four being mapped here, showing you Anasazi or Ancestral Pueblo, Hohokam, and Mogollon culture regions in the larger Southwest. And of course, the reason why archaeologists distinguish between these broad culture areas has to do with the kind of material artifacts that they find when they go to these sites. So they can go to, say, the Gila cliff dwellings, do excavations there, and they can say, well, based on the things that are left behind here, the group that left these, the group that created this stuff, had some kind of different or distinctive culture from the folks that lived at Mesa Verde, for instance. And they had some kind of different culture, different cultural expression through their material artifacts than the folks that lived at Casa Grande. And so they can define these different culture groups based on where they find particular artifacts or different architectural elements, different settlement patterns, what have you. So that's how we can even have these larger definitions of culture regions throughout the Southwest. Now here's a more zoomed in view of Arizona and New Mexico in particular, showing these, as they're calling them here, prehistoric civilization. Remember, they're not only layering the Hohokam, Anasazi, Mogollon groups here, but they're also putting in those sites from early indigenous settlement as well. So you're kind of seeing this long time scale all put onto one map. But nevertheless, it is helpful in looking at particularly Arizona to see in this map the four distinct culture groups and culture regions. So we have Hohokam, Mogollon, Sinagua, and the Ancestral Pueblo or Anasazi. Let's take a look more closely at the Anasazi Ancestral Hopi sites and culture region here. First thing about name. Perhaps you've heard this name Anasazi before. It's not really the name that is the most proper and most correct. It's better to say, I think, Ancestral Hopi. Anasazi is a name that means, really it comes from an outside perspective and being labeled on to these groups of folks, whereas the Hopi and Pueblo folks will refer to these groups as their ancestral peoples, ancestral Hopi, ancestral Pueblo. But nevertheless, you do hear that term Anasazi being used quite a bit, and you'll still see it in the literature fairly often. Here's the geography of that particular group, largely in northeastern Arizona, up on the Colorado Plateau. You can see that pretty clearly. And then, of course, extending up into the Four Corners region into New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado. perhaps one of the most distinctive and important sites, contemporary sites here within the larger ancestral Hopi, ancestral Pueblo area is Mesa Verde National Park. And you can go to Mesa Verde and you can visit some of these communities, some of these town sites, which are sort of colloquially known as cliff dwellings. And what folks have done here, quite literally, in this historical period, they built communities basically up along the cliff faces in this area of the Colorado Plateau. So this kind of landscape should be pretty familiar to you. You can see what it looks like. You have this big flat plateau area on top, but then you have these deeply incised canyons that cut down into the plateau, and it's in these canyons where these folks built their homes and their communities and their towns and settlements. Here's one of the most distinctive ones at Mesa Verde National Park called Cliff Palace. And so these were places that housed, hundreds of people and were quite sophisticated, and buildings that were many stories tall in several cases, and they were built up in the cliff faces, up in the rocks, just like this. A very distinctive settlement pattern, and one that sort of stood the test of time, at least for archaeologists going back and excavating these sites, being oftentimes in these alcoves and cave types locations. They're very well protected from the elements, and so these sites are well maintained in many cases. But you can find examples of these communities that are built right up along the edge of cliffs and in these alcoves all throughout that area of the Colorado Plateau. There are other sites, other important sites that are built more so out in the open. And these are what we might refer to as Pueblo sites. Pueblo coming from the Spanish term for a town. And so these Pueblo sites, unlike the cliff dwellings, they tend to be built out in these more open areas. And Pueblo Bonito in New Mexico is one of the more important ancestral Pueblo, ancestral Hopi communities. And you can see it here in this sort of half semicircle shape, both in the photograph from on the ground and this photograph from the aerial view here that you see in this image. So it's built up along the cliff face, as you can see, but it's built out on the flats. So it is more of a kind of community that exists in the open as opposed to the cliff dwellings in the previous slides. It's a fascinating site, and you can see that the infrastructure there is quite developed with a number of different buildings, essentially apartment-style buildings of several stories high and different communal spaces. Here's an artist's reconstruction of what the Pueblo Bonito site in Chaco Canyon might have looked like at the time that it was actually being used. And of course, there's a lot of speculation about what this site was doing, or what the people who lived in Pueblo Bonito were doing. And there's a lot of speculation that it was an important crossroads in larger trading areas, and it was sort of an economic center for regional and continental trade even, about 1,000 years ago. And you can see the settlement patterns here of the way that people lived. They very much lived in these concentrated communities in these large towns, or we might even call them small cities, where you had essentially apartment-style housing. People were living very close to one another, sharing a common wall. They were living on top of one another, oftentimes in these buildings that were 3, 4, and 5 stories high. Notice the ponderosa pine tree in the middle of the plaza there, very distinctive for the author, for the artist of this image to include that, but they actually did find remnants of trees that were put in that main plaza area. That wasn't, of course, a naturally growing pine tree there. That was brought in from somewhere else, and so it's speculated that it had some kind of communal, social, or religious significance for the community there, for the larger community in Pueblo Bonito. There are other cliff dwellings, we might call them, other sites where people have built their homes right into the cliffs in these other culture areas. And it's important that we look at those as well. That would include both the Sinagua and Mogollon groups. And you can see the geography of the Sinagua and the geography of the Mogollon culture groups as well. Sinagua really kind of clustered around the area that's now, really kind of right on the edge of the Colorado Plateau, Flagstaff, and heading down towards the Verde River, and then the Mogollon sites in southeastern Arizona, and really extending into New Mexico and adjacent parts of northern Sonora and Chihuahua. These culture groups also built their homes and built their communities, built their settlements in locations that were similar to the ancestral Hopi and ancestral Pueblo people. And the difference here being, of course, in the geography of where they were located. So here's Walnut Canyon near Flagstaff, Arizona. This is a really important Sinagua site. And you can see again that style of building, in this case, a home or some other kind of building right in the cliff overhang there. And similarly, if you go to the Gila cliff dwellings in the Gila Mountains in New Mexico, you find a similar kind of settlement pattern where people were building their homes in these alcoves up in the cliffs, up in these areas that are either on the Colorado Plateau or in these deep canyons in mountainous areas adjacent to the Colorado Plateau. The Sinagua group is also known for the construction of Pueblo-type settlements, and so here's another example of a classic Sinagua culture group Pueblo. So this is also similar in terms of its expression to the Pueblo Bonito in Chaco Canyon that I showed you earlier, but of course these are in two different culture regions. So the Pueblo Bonito in Chaco Canyon, that's part of the ancestral Hopi, ancestral Pueblo, or Anasazi culture region, and this one that you see here at Casa Malpais in Arizona is part of this larger Sinagua group. Or excuse me, part of this larger Mogollon group. So that's where you can see the Casa Malpais in far eastern Arizona, right on the New Mexico border. And here too, this was a pueblo, so a town, and you can read the information placard there with an estimated 120 rooms and may have housed as many as 300 or more than 300 people at one point. Okay, so we've looked at some of the settlement patterns of Anasazi, ancestral Hopi, ancestral Pueblo, Sinagua, and Mogollon groups. And now let's take a look at a culture region that's a bit closer to home for those of us who live here in the Phoenix Valley. That would be the Hohokam. And hopefully you can already see the sort of distinctive geographies of these culture groups, and you can see how each culture group maps on to different physiographic regions, different climate zones as well. What you'll notice about the Hohokam, of course, is that this is going to be a culture group that is really dominant in the lower elevation areas of the Sonoran Desert, right around the larger Phoenix area, but then up somewhat into the Basin and Range mountains of southeastern Arizona as well. The next time you're going to the airport in Phoenix, you can stop off and go to an extremely important Hohokam site known as Pueblo Grande. And this is an archaeological site and a museum today. You can go there, pay a small entrance fee, and you can walk around the grounds and you can see the structures, remnants of the structures, walls and rooms and things like that that once comprised this larger pueblo here in the Phoenix Valley. And you can also go to a museum and see some displays on the culture and archaeological significance of the Hohokam in this area. So of course the Hohokam, perhaps most widely and famously known for living in what's now the Phoenix Valley, and creating a vast system, a vast network of irrigation canals in towns and villages throughout the Phoenix Valley. It's oftentimes referred to as the former civilization in the valley that was sort of built on top of when Anglo settlers finally arrived on the scene in the 1860s and 1870s. Here's an artist's reconception of Pueblo Grande. Again, one of these pueblos where people were living in close proximity to one another, in apartment-style houses, several stories tall. And then what you see here is kind of being surrounded by farmland with irrigation canals. And then what you see off in the distance there is the Salt River. So of course, the reason why folks were here and the main thing that they were doing, farming, was made possible by the water that flowed through the Salt River and through the Phoenix Valley at this particular time. Pueblo Grande, of course, is a very important site in the larger Phoenix Valley, very important Hohokam site. And there are many others too. If you go upstream, so to speak, upstream on the Salt River and you go into Mesa, there are some sites there. And then downstream as well, there are important sites all throughout the valley. It's not uncommon for people in Phoenix to find potsherds or pieces of artifact or shell or other things that date from this era because the sort of spread of the civilization was so extensive throughout the valley, and they left so much behind that that's not uncommon for people to find those kinds of things in their backyard or while out for a walk around town or when they do big excavation projects in town for buildings or for highway projects. They oftentimes find important archaeological sites because this group was all over the valley and they had really shaped the valley in many ways in their liking in order to grow crops, in order to farm this area successfully. There's other important sites, of course, in this larger Hohokam culture region. We can point to the Casa Grande ruins, which are just outside of the town of Casa Grande today. And this is an archaeological area. Again, it was a pueblo, a quite large pueblo, and you can go and visit this and you can see the former extent of the community there. And sort of the hallmark of this was the big house, or the Casa Grande, which is in the center of the pueblo there. And this was a big house that was several stories high. And so when the Spanish arrived in the 1600s, and they were poking around the area, they found the Casa Grande ruins because at that point they were no longer being used, nobody was living there. They were essentially abandoned, and so the Spaniards sort of speculated about who may have built that, and they gave it the name Casa Grande. Here's the Casa Grande ruins in the 1930s, and you can see the figure, the human figure in the bottom right there. And again, that big house, several stories tall, probably could have housed several families, and there were other structures around that in that area. So these were very significant from an archaeological standpoint, very significant in terms of their architecture, and of course the level of sophistication that it took to build not only these communities and these towns, the physical infrastructure of these towns, but also the entire physical infrastructure of canals and irrigation ditches that brought water from the Salt River to irrigate the Hohokam fields in the larger Phoenix Valley. The landscape of the Sonoran Desert, particularly in the areas of Phoenix and Tucson and the areas in between Phoenix and Tucson, are just littered with Hohokam sites. Again, it was an area that was extensively worked and modified by the Hohokam, and so it's not just their communities and agricultural fields in the valleys, but there are also these areas along the Santa Cruz River Valley in the Tucson area where they've found essentially terraced hillsides. And these terraces, or trincheras, were constructed by the Hohokam. And there's speculation about why the Hohokam built these terraces up on the hillside. And One possibility is that they were part of a larger sort of farming project, and they built these terraces to collect water as it ran off down the mountainside, and they might have grown crops there. And of course, another explanation is that they were perhaps built for defensive purposes, that there may have been some kind of regional warfare that was going on, and so they went up into the mountains and built these sort of defensive terraces where they could better protect themselves from an enemy that might be moving into the area. So there's speculation, of course, about what these trincheras were built for, a couple different reasons thrown out there, but they can be quite extensive on these hillsides, especially in the Santa Cruz River Valley between Tucson and Phoenix. And of course, perhaps the most astonishing thing in many ways was the extent of prehistoric irrigation canals that were built in the valley by the Hohokam at this time. And these were not, just simply somebody going out along the edge of the river and, a single person with a shovel, like just digging a ditch to bring water off the river and to flood a field, for one time or something like that. These were extensive, highly engineered water withdrawals and irrigation canals that brought water off of the Salt River and sent it out into the valley along a whole series of connecting smaller feeder canals and, watering many different fields throughout the valley. And so this image is just showing you where some of those canals were. And these were canals, that were, some of them, 20 feet deep and, 50 feet across. They were massive. And remember, these were all built with human power. There was no machinery, nor was there even animal power to dig these. And they stretched for many miles, dozens of miles across the valley. So this was not just a one-off thing or some kind of casual project. This was very much a coordinated, highly engineered activity of the Hohokam people. And it's telling how good they were, how sophisticated they were with their water engineering, because when Anglo settlers arrived in the 1860s and into the early 20th century, mostly what they did was they re-excavated the old Hohokam canals. So they realized, well, the Hohokam knew where to build the canals, and they built them there for a reason. Those were the best places to take water off the Salt River and the best way to distribute it through the valley. And so many of our canals really today have this legacy of once being Hohokam canals. So it's really fascinating, and of course turned the entire valley into an agricultural civilization. The other piece of this that's really fascinating is the larger context in which this is happening. We can think of the ancestral Hopi and Mogollon cultures, Colorado Plateau and the Basin and Range, and then the Hohokam cultures in the lower Sonoran Desert area. Of course, these folks were not just isolated and, entirely doing their own thing. They were constantly trading with one another and in communication with one another, and ideas and goods were flowing back and forth. And there was even a larger axis here of trade and transportation and communication that extended for 1,000 miles, a couple thousand miles even, down into what's now considered to be Central America. And this is really fascinating. You see this happening in many cases from the Hohokam communities in the Phoenix Valley. A lot of times when archaeologists excavate these important sites, they find seashells, and those seashells are in the Phoenix Valley because there was a pretty well-established trade going down to the Sea of Cortez, going down to the ocean, for instance, the Gulf of California, and collecting various resources from the sea and then bringing them back up to the Phoenix Valley. But those trade routes extended even further south. And one of the ways that we know this is because we find objects in these archaeological sites up in the Southwest, up in the Phoenix area, that have their origin in Central America, in southern Mexico and Central America. So scarlet macaw feathers, for instance, a tropical bird, which most definitely did not live up in Arizona, those feathers have been found way far north up in the contemporary Southwest, and other kinds of products as well. And it's pretty widely understood that there were these really important north-south trade routes that connected, for instance, Hohokam culture region, Hohokam settlements and civilization, with the civilizations that we know of in being southern Mexico and Central America, namely the Maya and some of these other really important groups in that area. We also see it in some material expressions of the various groups in the Southwest. For instance, we find ball courts in some Hohokam sites, and these ball courts are widely understood to have come from Central America. This was a kind of game that people played with a ball and a hoop in Central America, and we find this same architecture up in the Southwest in various Hohokam sites. So it's widely understood that there was this larger network of trade going on between what's now the contemporary Southwest and going south into Mexico and Central America. So this north-south trade axis was really the dominant axis of trade, transportation, and communication. You could say that the groups in the Southwest were more intimately connected with these groups 2,000 miles to the south than they were perhaps even with groups over in California or on the east coast of North America at this time.